I see we have a few of our wonderful Hudson River Museum docents here with us today. Welcome, docents.
Okay, we're live.
I see that icon. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you. I think in 1 minute we'll get started. We have, Chris is sending greetings from Tempe, Arizona.
Oh, wow.
Hi, Chris. Hi, Chris. Welcome. How did you find out about this program? You can put it in the chat.
Have you ever done work out in Arizona, Alison?
No, I have not.
Huh. Oh.
He says he's an old NYC boy. Maybe even an old Yonkers boy.
I don't know. How are things out in Arizona? Warm and dry?
Yeah. I see we've got 12 people so far.
Yeah.
Are there more people in the waiting room?
Not at the moment. I think we'll give it till it turns to 1:34 and then we will get started for real. Okay. Okay. All right. It's if anyone else comes into the waiting room, we will be more than pleased to let them in. I want to welcome everybody here from wherever you are tuning in, near and far. And my name is Sarah Linda Lickblau. I'm Director of Education. I'm here with my colleagues, Olivia Cipriano, who is the Operations and Program Manager, and our guest of honor today, Alison Moritsugu, about whom you will hear more presently. Just before we get started, a little housekeeping. Just so you know, you are muted upon entry, but your cameras are on unless and until you turn them off. So just so that you know that you can control that portion of your program. We will be going through the program, and at the end, Laura and Alison will be taking your comments and questions. The chat and the comments section in Facebook will be facilitated by Olivia. Will a recorded version be available on Facebook later on? Yes, that has a life after the fact. So we have our synchronous program, and then we call it the asynchronous program, so that you can tune in later, you can bring your friends, and they can all view the program subsequently on Facebook. So which we're really happy about, because it really expands our reach and accessibility. And today's program, we are particularly excited about for many reasons. It is a virtual studio visit with Alison Moritsugu. And Alison will be giving you a rare and privileged look into her work and the genesis and the meaning in conversation with Laura Vookles. So there will be a portion of the program that in which Alison will be going through her work, and then we will pause the PowerPoint, and she will be giving us a live, in the moment tour of her actual studio. So you're really, really in for a treat. I've known Alison for a number of years. And have just been so pleased and happy to be able to work with her in many different ways. I first met her when her work, which you see pictured here, was featured in Imaging the River. That was in 2003, 2004. We're going way back here, right? And we are so fortunate in that this piece was brought into the collection of the Hudson River Museum. So we have been able to draw on it in many different ways over the years. Subsequent to her being in Imaging the River, Alison has been a teaching artist for us. She has conducted watercolor workshops. She has taken us on tours of in our program called Artist Insights, where she walked around in an exhibit that Laura curated a number of years ago called Walks with Artists, the Hudson Valley and Beyond. And now this painted log is in the exhibition, the current exhibition, long title, Landscape Art and Virtual Travel, Highlights from the Collections of the HRM and Art Bridges. This exhibit, which is on view through next August. So we hope that everyone, even if you're in Arizona, may be able to see it in person. But if not, we have had virtual tours of this exhibit, and we will have more anon, which I will mention later. But this exhibit really was inspired by loans from Art Bridges, a foundation that is a wonderful supporter of the museum. There is an installation of Cynthia Daniel's work and of David Hockney's work. And we have brought into a conversation with those works pieces from our permanent collection. And Art Bridges supports museums in this way to reinvigorate and energize their personal their private, sorry, their permanent collections by engendering new dialogue. And I'm so excited about the way that Alison's piece interacts with other pieces in this exhibit of landscapes of various kinds. And actually, Alison obviously incorporates materials found in nature as her canvas, and it prompts us to explore the precarious relationship between humans and the environment. The idyllic scenes rendered on, for example, a fallen tree, compel us not to fall for false assurances that the wilderness we take for granted will always exist without our advocacy. So not only does Alison present us with miniaturized Hudson River landscapes, but she presents us with a call to action to preserve them and to preserve our environment and to love our environment. And to introduce the program, to introduce Alison, I want to introduce my wonderful colleague, Laura Vookles, who is chair of the Curatorial Department. Laura, you're on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah Linda. I'm really excited about this program today. I'm really excited that Alison's work is in our collection, and it was probably implied, but just to be clear, that piece was donated to us by Alison. So thank you, Alison. That was a few years after Imaging the River in 2009. And we have used it a lot since then. I just personally love Alison's work, and as an art historian, I love Alison's work. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Alison, and then we're going to talk a little bit of an overview of her work before she goes into the slideshow. Alison Moritsugu was born and raised in Hawaii and lives and works in Beacon, New York, where we're visiting her today. She left the islands after high school and studied art at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. And then she continued with this calling to earn a Master of Fine Arts from the School of Visual Arts in New York City. Alison's work has been exhibited in solo shows at the Honolulu Museum of and the Knoxville Museum of Art, the Lux Art Institute in San Diego, the John Michael Kohler Arts Center, and Little John Contemporary. As Sarah Linda said, she was featured in our 2003 exhibition, Imaging the River. And she, in 2011, she completed a mosaic commission for the MTA Arts for Transit. And this past summer, she was in a virtual group exhibition titled Eco Urgency at Wave Hill, which is very close to the museum in Riverdale. And Alison has received a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship in Painting, participated in residencies at the Cité Internationale des Arts in Yaddo, the McDowell Colony, and the Marie Walsh Sharp Space Program. So, that's all very illustrious and impressive, but I want you to hear from Alison. So, Alison, let's talk a little bit about the log paintings and how you perceive their relation to our relationship with the environment. Do you want to say something about that to everybody?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for joining in today. I'm broadcasting from Beacon, New York, from my studio. In terms of my log paintings, I've always been interested in the tradition of landscape painting. So I love the landscape tradition going back to the 17th century Dutch landscape painters, to the Claudian landscapes, which are landscapes done by Claude Lorraine, very classical, but incorporate idealized images of idyllic scenes of nature. And he in turn influenced the 19th century British painters, John Constable and Turner, and they in turn influenced Thomas Cole, who is considered the father of Hudson River School painting. The Hudson River School painters, and I live in the Hudson River, so a lot of the images they paint make a lot of sense to me in terms of the light and how they depict certain scenes in nature. I've always been drawn to, and I admire these landscape traditions. At the same time, I've also questioned the tradition of landscape painting. So I'm very interested in how, especially idealized images of the land, actually affect and influence our concept of what's going on in nature. So with the log paintings, this was sort of an aha moment I had in an artist residency when I started to paint landscapes on logs. But what I was thinking about at the time is, how is an image of nature different from actual nature? And with the log paintings, I'm juxtaposing side by side an image and real nature, right, and our concept of nature, and how the two are very different.
I mean, I'm curious, Alison, did you study a lot of art history at Washington U or at SVA, or did living in the Hudson River Valley lead you to these inquiries?
Well, I took a lot of art history courses at Washington University, and that got me my interest peaked in art history. It wasn't until I moved to New York that I really fell in love with the Hudson River School paintings. And I still remember going to the American Wing in the Met and seeing the huge Bierstadt paintings. And there's two rooms that are just amazing, where the paintings are hung gallery style. And, that was sort of a seminal moment. Oh my goodness, these are so beautiful. And I think I got enamored with the beauty of these paintings. That really drew me in.
And they can be huge, in case anybody's never seen them. They can be as much as 8 by 10 feet, I think, some of them. But speaking of size, I notice a lot of times especially in some of the pieces we're going to see later in your studio, your paintings are almost miniatures. You're very interested in tiny details. And I'm interested in your thought process about reducing nature to such a tiny scale.
I do paint a lot of details in my images. Sometimes I'll be in there painting sort of every highlight on a leaf to represent a bush or a tree. I love the idea of details, and it parallels what goes on in nature. You don't always know what's really happening in the environment unless you're really paying attention to the tiny details. In fact, so much of what's going on and changing in our environment is almost imperceptible, and it takes people like scientists who are collecting data and monitoring changes to really be the first people to say, hey, something's going on here. So I think as an artist, and I think as anyone, a steward of the land, it's so important to focus on the details, because they can tell so much about what may happen in the future. So I do put a lot of emphasis on detail.
I mean, I think a lot of times to me, the best art and the best art exhibits are the kind that inspire us to look at the real world differently when we go back outside. Even though you haven't lived in Hawaii for a long time, I know that your experience growing up there is really entrenched in your work. Do you want to say something about that for people?
Of course, I think I grew up in Hawaii during the 60s and 70s. And even though I have done a series of work that deals with Hawaii, but most of these log paintings have nothing to do with Hawaii, except maybe in terms of how I approach the pieces. Growing up in Hawaii, when I grew up there was a much stronger connection with nature. You know, instead of playing in our backyard, we would go hike to the waterfall in the back of the valley where we lived, or we'd play in the streams or go snorkeling. There's a different kind of relationship, or there was at the time, between humans and the land. And I saw it even more so in my grandparents' generation and my parents' generation. There's this idea. A good example is the word aina, which in direct translation to English means land. But this Hawaiian word encompasses so much more. In fact, I don't think there's any word in the English language that expresses this, because aina also means that which feeds us. So in one word, we have a word that describes the land. It describes our relationship to the land. And on top of that, it describes the fact that if we are good stewards of the land will help provide us our sustenance. And so aina means all of that, and sort of that's sort of the way of thinking, or used to be, in Hawaii. And I go back every year, and I've gone back every year since, except for this past year because of the pandemic. And I've seen how much the land has changed since my childhood. Also, I think growing up in Hawaii, I saw how tourism affected the land and the state of Hawaii. I think a lot of places in the world are seeing that tourism is a double-edged sword. So it is the main driver of the economy in Hawaii, but at the same time, it also changes the environment. It changes land use. It creates cultural commodification. So that idea of changing landscape based on images of the land, whether they're tourist-based images to attract more tourists, that sort of, all that stuff goes into what I think about when I create my work.
Well, I mean, in a lesser way, that plays a big role in the development of the Hudson River School in New York City, right by the Catskills. And the paintings were driving tourists up to the Catskills, and painters were going there. And it was all very cyclical and very, a double-edged sword, like you say, interesting, beautiful places were getting overrun with tourists. And yes, it's a big story, but I think probably everyone would like to look at some slides of your work if you want to show some people other pieces besides just our wonderful log.
So this 3 of these logs were the first time I painted on log slices. I had an artist residency in the month of December at Yaddo, and I went up there. I had prepared these tiny wood panels that I had gessoed. So I was going to spend the month painting my landscapes on these tiny wood panels that eventually I would frame. And every morning I would go for a walk in the woods, and I saw these perfectly stacked cords of firewood. And they all had this perfect planar surface on one end, which is where the log was cut. And it seemed to make more sense to paint on the ends of the logs than on my panels. So that's the genesis of my painting on logs. That's where it happened. Next slide. This is a detail of log number 7. And you can see how as much as possible, I try and meld the image of the landscape into the log itself, but there's always this tension between the two. And I use the cracks. I think they're a really important part of my pieces. Next slide. This is a detail of log number 5 and log number 8. And again, the crack becomes a really important part of the piece. And
Alison, if I could stop you for a moment, I have a question of something that's always intrigued me about these. I feel like I'm looking into the log. And I mean, does that ever cross your mind that instead of living on the surface of the log, the painting is somehow like almost like you're looking at a ship in a bottle?
It's funny, when I was painting these, I conceptually thought of the flat surfaces of the log as my canvas. And it was actually, when I finished them, people would comment, oh, I feel like I'm looking into, almost telescopically into the landscape. And that's when I realized, oh, there's almost a whole nother world in the log, but you can't actually enter the log because of the surface of the painting. Next slide. After I got back from Yaddo, I started to create these, what I call composite landscapes. So the image is a single landscape that's been broken into pieces, and each piece is on the cross section of the log, and these hang on the wall. So this one was done in 2016, called Oval Landscape number 3. Next slide. And here you can see the thickness of the log. So the bark almost creates a frame around each piece. And with these pieces, I'm also very interested in how we perceive or how we see a landscape. So with these pieces, rather than a landscape like what Claude Lorraine would paint, where it's almost like a stage set, where you just enter the landscape, with these, it's almost as if your brain has to put the pieces together and then you can see the landscape. I do find it interesting, and I like to challenge the viewer to really have to work on looking to see the landscapes. And so these composite pieces do that for me. Next slide. These are much larger landscapes. The one on the left is called Arcady, and the one on the right is called Conquest. So these are 2 of a 3-part series. And this series was inspired by Thomas Cole's 5-series allegorical painting series called The Course of Empire. And Thomas Cole painted a series of landscapes which depicted the land as it moved from a wilderness state to a civilized state to destruction and finally ending. His last painting is called Desolation. So it sort of shows how land changes, and what we think is a civilized state where it's highly developed may not be the pinnacle of that land. It may continue on and become ravaged and end up being destroyed.
And where was this photograph taken? Where was this installation, Alison?
This was at the Monique Knowlton Gallery in New York City. I had a solo show there. Next slide. This is the first painting of that series, and this is called Wilderness. This is made up of 198 log slices, and you could see it forms one landscape: the sky, the clouds, the mountains, and then the foreground. As this series progresses, the outer shape of the painting becomes less organic and becomes more controlled. And the time of day changes. For instance, Wilderness is sort of the beginning of the day. Next slide. This is a detail of Wilderness. It gives you an idea of some of the detail in the painting.
Alison, when you plan these, do you make an overall drawing of the whole landscape before you segment it out?
I do, and for these paintings, I had large pieces of butcher paper that I had on the wall, and I did these very slightly loose sketches of the full landscape. So I don't have the individual logs drawn in, I just do one giant landscape. And then I transfer the landscape onto the logs, and this is where it becomes tricky because the important information has to occur on a log slice, right? If it happens in the space between it, things don't make sense. So then there's more figuring out of the composition and what should be on each log. And then after that, I get to start to paint. Next slide. This is the second in the series called Arcady, which shows an idyllic pastoral scene. This takes place in the day. The shape is a little more controlled, and in the foreground and middle ground, there are sheep in the fields. And the next slide shows the last scene of the series. This is called Conquest. So it's the end of day. The frame is more oval in shape, and in the midground and foreground are felled and cut trees. And next slide. This is a painting I did while at another artist residency in California called the Jurassic Artist Residency. I did this in 1995. So I found on site this area where they had a lot of scraps from redwood trees. They sort of called it their scrap pile. And I found this one log that was shaped like a half circle on its cut face. It had about 80 rings in it. So this tree must have been that age when it got chopped down. I ended up doing a painting of the landscape that you would see if you were standing in front of that log, of the Jurassic Hills and the La Honda open space preserve in the background. Next slide. So this shows you the painting in progress. I resided in one of the houses on the property, which was about half a mile away from this site. So every morning I would pack up my oil paints and pack a lunch and hike down to the site and do my painting on site. Next slide. And this is the final painting in 1995. And you can see again how the cracks play an integral part of the piece. Next slide. This is the painting in 2000, what was it, 1995. So this is the painting 11 years later. And you can see that it's been weathered by age. With this piece, I left it outdoors. Let's see, when we see paintings in museums, they've been preserved and protected and restored. So that image of the landscape is hopefully preserved into perpetuity. I wanted to invert that concept where I wanted the image to be dictated by the life of the log itself. So, and also with the Hudson River School painters, a lot of the scenes they've painted no longer exist in the state that you see in the painting. The area's been developed, or trees have been felled or cleared. So with this piece, I really wanted nature to dictate, to have control over the life of the image. So I kind of flipped it. Next slide. And Laura, you asked about the kind of studies I do for my paintings. Sometimes they're looser. This is a much tighter study. This is Conte crayon on paper. And this was a study I did for a piece called The Approaching Storm. So in this one, I worked out the composition, but also the details, what I would highlight in terms of which leaves, how many, how detailed the leaves would be, the way the water would work. Next slide shows the final painting. And you can see that I do work out a lot in the sketch, but a lot does change once I start painting on the log slides. For instance, I removed the tree in the foreground in the final painting because I wanted the emphasis to be on that large crevice that comes in from the right in the painting. So I tweaked that. Also, some of the reflections are changed. The rocks are a little different, but most of the composition is worked out in the sketch.
I mean, I am interested in your technique, Alison, because I know when you were studying, probably it was in sort of the post-abstract era, the post-minimalist era, when artists were turning back to imagery. But this kind of very detailed, highly luminous technique, I mean, is that something that they were really teaching you at art school, or did you have to study and learn that on your own?
I did have to study and learn a lot of it on my own. When I was at the School of Visual Art, I had a great painting instructor, Gregory Crane, who is an amazing landscape painter. He taught us the basics of painting. I was not painting landscape painting at the time. I was learning how to paint a skull and oranges and still lifes, just sort of the very basics of landscape, of painting, but using a traditional painting palette. And I use that same palette today when I do my landscape painting. After I graduated from the School of Visual Art, that's when I really started to become enamored with Hudson River School paintings. And I was painting landscapes on wood panels, and I just kept painting and looking at landscape painting, especially going to the Met a lot of times, going to museums, and just learning by doing, basically. You know, and also looking up how old masters would do paintings, because a lot of the painting techniques are from
Ancient.
that.
Very ancient.
Yeah. Next slide. This is the final painting, The Approaching Storm. Next slide. These are two tall sassafras slices, tall sassafras slice 1 and 2. These are, not only do I paint very tiny landscapes, but I also paint very large landscapes. These are almost 8 feet tall, about the height of a surfboard. They kind of look like surfboards when they're up on the wall as well. And these are what I call hybrid landscapes. So with these, I was trying to combine two landscape traditions. I have compositions inspired by the Northern Song Chinese school of painting, but these are painted akin to the Hudson River School. Now, next slide. And here they are. I had a solo exhibition at the Lux Art Institute, and you can see the 3 tall sassafras slices on the wall. And this gives you an idea of their scale. Next slide. And this is a detail of tall sassafras slice number 2. And again, you can see the verticality in everything in the painting. The mist shrouds certain areas. The rocks and the mountains are all upward. And on these paintings, there is no horizon line. Unlike a lot of European landscape tradition, there's no vista. It's not expansive. With Chinese painting, you understand the landscape by traveling through it. And so that's what these paintings were about. And I guess it's time for the live studio tour. So let me unplug my power cord. All right, let's see. Sorry about that, everyone. All right, there, I flipped the screen. Do you want to hold this, please? So this is what is being filmed. Okay, well, welcome to my studio. Come in. You can see I have a lot of logs, canvases here to eventually paint, and then some pieces here which I set up so you can see some of my work. And we'll start with these 3 log slices. So these are 3 of the logs from that first image you saw, the log series. And we've got the detailed landscape on the end of the log. And you can see that the cracks and the the checks in the wood have become a very integral part of the piece. Sometimes I use the cracks to enhance the painting or to frame the painting. Sometimes I use the cracks as a way of shattering the flat image that you see on the front. Down on the floor here on a dolly, because this thing is really heavy, is a piece called Trophy. So I've got it on wheels so I can push it around the studio if I need to move it. This piece was done in 1995. So in 1993, a friend of mine called me up. She was living in Greenwich, Connecticut, and she said, a nor'easter just blew by and it took down all these trees. So this is a Norway maple. And she said, there's these huge Norway maple stumps on the street. You should come up and get them. And I was living in the city at the time. So I hired 3 men in a van moving, and we went up to Greenwich, Connecticut, and they loaded these big stumps into the back of the truck, and they brought everything down from my studio in Brooklyn. And we sat in my studio for about 3 to 4 years for the wood to dry, because when the wood is freshly cut, it has a lot of moisture. So over time, the moisture evaporates and the wood becomes smaller, both in terms of its size, volume, but also it becomes drier and more stable. So on this piece, and Laura, you mentioned it almost looks like you're looking into landscape. So this piece, I created a landscape where the trees almost framed the image of the mountain, but at the same time, the cracks, this huge crack almost shatters the image. And it almost looks to me sometimes like a shattered mirror.
Yes, if I could, I'll only interrupt this once, but I was thinking that about the cracks as well. In my mind, in my imagination, are they cracks in the glass we're peering through to see the landscape, or are they somehow cracks in the landscape?
Right, exactly. Yeah, you could think about it both ways. And actually, speaking about logs, this is what I found really interesting when I started to paint on log slices and I started to show some of this work. I got more questions about the log than about the painting. So it was almost as if people were very familiar with landscape images, but less familiar with the wood and the log the painting is on. So it's very telling that, you know, our knowledge of nature, our connection with nature, you know, maybe we're not as connected to actual land and nature than we think we are, because we're just so used to seeing them in images. And then these 3 pieces, they look like three sticks leaning against the wall. So these are my walking sticks. And from afar, they look like they're just sticks on a wall. But if you come in close, you come in closer and look at the top of each stick, I painted a landscape on them. So the stick at the left, this one is called Falls. It's about the size of a quarter. The stick in the center is called Field. That's about the size of a $50. And then the stick on the right is very tiny. The painting is called Peak, and that's about the size of a large dime. So with these walking sticks, I was sort of envisioning, you know, you've got your walking stick, you're walking along on your hike, and you see a sight. So these almost become touchstones to what you've seen along your journey. And I originally had 6 walking sticks on the wall, and they were separated by a certain amount of space, almost indicating the pace of your walk. And now we'll go to the other side of my studio, past my stack of logs, to these 2 paintings. The painting on the easel is called Vestige, and the painting on the wall is called Remnant. So these are sister paintings. These are done on ash slices. I think there were about 79 growth rings on these paintings. We'll focus. Okay. we'll focus on this one here. This is called We Are the Ash, in parentheses, Remnant. So inspiration from the Hudson River School. It looks very idyllic. You've got your old tree that's gnarled and frames the canvas. You've got your horizon line in the background. You've got the distant mountains and then a body of water, a stream running through it. But if on closer inspection, you'll notice some kind of strange things in this painting, such as there's a woodpecker. And there are these purple things hanging off the top of these trees here. These are called purple prism traps. And some of the trees have bark removed around their base. These are called tree girdles. And also in this old tree, there's signs of larval galleries of insect infestation. So this painting is really about the emerald ash borer, which is an emerald colored insect that is native to Eastern Russia and Asia. And it was introduced and first detected in the United States in 2002 in Upper Michigan. And the emerald ash borer has no predators in North America. So it's been destroying trees since 2002. In fact, by 2013, over 8 billion ash trees have died. And in New York State, 20 to 30% of our trees are ash trees. And of those, 80 to 90% have been infested with the emerald ash borer. One way to detect, it's a very tricky situation, difficult situation, because there's really no way to detect the presence of the emerald ash borer. It's only when the tops of the tree canopy die away that one realizes, oh, that tree has been infested, and by then it's too late to save the tree. So the purple prism traps and the tree girdling were done early on as mitigation efforts and detection efforts to try and figure out where these insects were. These would trap the insects, and scientists would come and check them to see how many insects were in the traps. Tree girdles were done to make the tree weakened, which would attract the emerald ash borer. They're almost like decoy trees, and they would check to see if these trees would be infested, and if they were, then they knew emerald ash borer was in the area. So there's another interesting thing to these two paintings. They were originally going to be in a group show called Eco Urgency at Wave Hill in early April, but the actual show got canceled because of the pandemic, and it got turned into a virtual show, which is on the Wave Hill website. So all the artists, rather than having pieces in the show, did videos, either a video interview or did their own video, and that's on the Wave Hill website. So while we were in quarantine and these pieces were packed up in their boxes to go to Wave Hill, I ended up changing their names. This one was originally called Vestige, this one Remnant, but I added We Are the Ash to the front of the name. So this is called We Are the Ash Vestige and We Are the Ash Remnant. Because I realized during the shutdown that what's happening to the ash tree is essentially what we're experiencing with SARS-CoV-2. We don't have any immunity or antibodies to this virus. It's really hard to detect the presence of it. We've got mitigation attempts. There's so many parallels in terms of collecting the data, disseminating the data, educating the public about the emerald ash borer or SARS-CoV-2. So that's what these two paintings are about. I guess we'll move over to this large wallpaper. So the other thing I do, besides painting on log slices, I do sculptural work, but I also create these large wallpapers. So this is one panel of a wallpaper that, if it were to be installed, would be repeated, so this entire wall would be covered with this pattern. And this is called chaparro repeat. And chaparro in Spanish means small, squat, or means scrub brush, which is the native plant of the chaparral environment in Southern California. This landscape alternates these two vignettes. So we've got this vignette, which shows the native chaparral and all the endemic plants to that area. And they've all evolved to this very dry climate. And also with the native chaparral environment, fire is a natural, normal part of the environment. So with the native chaparral, fire burns at once every 30 to 150 years. In fact, a lot of these plants in this environment need fire for their seeds to germinate. This image here is also a landscape in Southern California, but these plants are all the introduced invasive plants that have come in. And actually, we're going to move over to the gouache that I did first to create the wallpaper. So in this image here, you have a lot of the weedy invasive plants such as black mustard, fillory, Arundodonax, which is a giant reed, pampas grass, and eucalyptus. And these plants thrive in disturbed or areas of perturbation where the land has been disrupted. And these come in, they grow really fast. They also are what's called flashy fuels, which means that they catch fire faster, they ignite faster, and that fire spreads faster. This fire may not burn as hot as a chaparral fire, but it just spreads so much faster and it's much quicker to ignite. So what's happened in California is where there was the endemic chaparral environment, when that gets disturbed, these come into play, and then these catch fire, and then once there's a wildfire, because these are such fast-growing plants, there's not enough time for the native chaparral to establish themselves again. So these grow back, and again, you have this repeated fire cycle that is occurring on a faster and faster cycle. So instead of 30 to 150 years, now there's a fire every 5 years, or every other year, or every year. So this is part of the idea behind this wallpaper, where it's a repeat of images of fire. And that's the end of my studio tour. So let me do some acrobatics here and get the camera switched around.
Well, I think we were going to see if I believe a lot of questions have been coming in on the chat here. I didn't see any on Facebook. What do you say, Olivia?
Yeah, and there's nothing on Facebook, but we do have a ton in the chat over here. So our friend David, who is actually one of our docents, asked, is the untitled log two separate landscapes or one landscape seen binocularly?
I have a lot of pieces that are called untitled log. Which one?
I think he might be referring to the one that's in our current exhibition.
Oh, those. I think when I painted those, I envisioned them in my mind as being one landscape, one scene basically, and I took different sections of the scene and put them on the two ends of the log.
Okay, thank you. And okay, let's see. Sarah Linda answered one. Is the wallpaper a digital print or
It is. So from the gouache that I did, I have the gouache scanned in. So I have a digital file that I bring into Photoshop, and then I create my repeat pattern from that. And then it gets printed out digitally.
Oh, that's really cool, actually.
Like 3-part process.
Yeah, that's really fun though.
It prompted a question from me. Have you installed it somewhere? Have people, like, as a whole installation in a room somehow, or how have you used it? It's not like people have actually papered their living rooms with it, right? It's just an artwork.
It is, but wouldn't it be great to have this? Well, I don't know if you want to see wildfire on your wall, but so I always thought it would be, well, to answer your question, this paper has been shown at Little John Contemporary, and I was in a show out in California at Cal State Fullerton, where we didn't do an entire wall. We did a large part of a wall, but I have done wallpapers at the Katona Museum, at the SVA Gallery, at Little John Contemporary, where I have, there are other designs that I've wallpapered the whole wall. And back to what I was saying earlier, wallpaper is one of the decorative arts that's purely decorative, right? And so oftentimes, especially toiles, you'll get scenes of idyllic landscapes. Again, you know, my interest in idyllic landscapes, and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if people actually had wallpaper that showed what actually is happening in the environment?
Yeah.
Well, I would be interested to hear you say a little bit more about, you mentioned at the beginning about people looking at paintings which are idealized landscapes, or even like photographs of nature on Instagram are often like filtered and photoshopped and screened, and you know, they will maybe like turn the camera to one scene as opposed to another scene that might have shown something else. I mean, you started to talk a little bit about how our idea of actual nature is affected by these images. Now that we've seen all your work, do you want to sum that up a little more?
Well, sure. And I think it harkens back to growing up in a place where tourism was the main economy. So the images of Hawaii that would be sent out to get people to visit were idealized images of the beaches and vistas and tourist scenic views, but there would be no litter or no crowds in the scene, just a beautiful shot. And I would go back, especially in the early 2000s, to a lot of these scenic overviews, and it would be packed with tourists, and there'd be tourists scrambling on the rocks. And especially in the age of social media, there'd be, you know, it was like mountain goats, people with selfie sticks, you know, trying to get the perfect pose so they could have their face with the beautiful image and nobody else. But if you were there at the actual location, it was kind of a zoo. So that's the idea of idealized landscapes. And they are beautiful because I love Hudson River School paintings, but I also know that the Hudson River School, especially after Cole, those paintings also enforce the idea of manifest destiny. You know, they depicted that concept where the land resources were unlimited, and it was America's God-given right to expand from East Coast to West Coast, even to Puerto Rico and Hawaii and Guam. You know, it's the idea that to show that America was really progressing and evolving as a country meant annexing more and more land. So the Hudson River School painters are kind of associated with that too. So I do know that a very beautiful landscape also has other implications. So I love landscapes, but I'm also wary of what I'm seeing, or I think about the viewpoint the artist has taken, because landscapes themselves implicate a bit of a human dominance, just the idea of landscape.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. There was a famous, an essay that was written in the 1990s for a show called Between Home and Heaven that the Smithsonian American Art did by Carol Ann Marling. And she was talking about how you're never there. You're always looking at something you call a landscape or a beautiful view. And there's that distance created by you even naming it as such, you know. But why don't we see if somebody else has some questions besides just me?
Yeah, we actually have some questions about the preference of log and the way you treat them. Alex was wondering if you prefer painting on long logs or on thinner log slices.
Oh, I don't, it's a little bit like the fish market, right? I don't actually say, all right, I want to get a log that's a certain shape and a certain length, and I go looking for it. How it works is whatever log I run into, or if somebody shows up with a log, like I take what is available. And then from there, I think about the log. A lot of times it sits in my studio for a long time. Like I've got some of these logs have been here for 15 years or so because I don't know what to do with them until I know what to do with them. So in terms of if I prefer longer logs to shorter logs, I mean, you can see from my work, it's a whole variety. So there has to be something about the log, no matter what its shape or size, that's compelling in some way. And that's how I end up painting on them.
That's really interesting. Sarah Linda was wondering if you treat the logs in any way apart from letting them dry over time. And is there a coating over the finished landscapes? And if you use oil paint?
I should have said that I do paint in oils. So that's sort of the very basic thing. I do let the logs dry, you know, to get them as stable as possible. And I also make sure there's no bugs in the log. So anything in my studio, yeah, if friends come up to me, oh, I've got this log, you want to take it? But I'm very picky about the logs I bring into my studio to make sure there's no kind of insect infestation. In terms of drying the wood, sometimes they're kiln dried, sometimes they are air dried for a very long period of time. And in terms of the coating on the log painting, some of them have a varnish coat. And so I think when we went around in the Zoom video, some may seem to be a little more glossy. That's because they have a coat of varnish, which is sort of traditional in oil painting.
Does anybody else have any questions? Feel free to put them in the Facebook comments or in the chat. Someone was wondering if the way in which your composite landscapes are hung be changed, or do you determine the strict parameters for each one?
Very, very strict. You know, it's funny, if even one of the logs is even a quarter of an inch higher, it somehow jars the entire visual unification of the log. It's funny if one thing doesn't quite match up. So I'm very regimented in how the pieces are hung.
Of course. That's really interesting, and it makes sense in a lot of ways. Do you use gesso ground under the oil?
I do. Once the wood's dried and sanded, I apply a coat of gesso. And then from there, I do a ground color, and then I do my painting. Again, very traditional, right? It's just the support that's different. Rather than canvas, the support is now a log slice.
Yeah. Sorry, Laura. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one thing. You know, when I was saying before that when I'm looking at our piece, I imagine that I'm looking into the log, and I really love that idea too, that you answered the question, that you see it as the same scene. It's almost like we could look into the log from two other directions. But then as soon as I had seen the large pieces on the wall, it's like you've pierced the wall in that many places to look through, you know, so the idea of a window in to look at a landscape becomes even more set in my mind, that we're looking through all these little portholes into the big picture.
And the funny thing is that the logs are not debossed right into the wall. They're like they stick out. So you're looking in, but you're looking on something that's sticking out.
Yeah. So I think that's all we have. Let's see. Okay, so someone was talking about the composite landscapes again, and how did you come up with the idea of composite landscape?
I'm trying to think back. Okay, I think, right, what I had one big log slice, and I painted a painting at the end of that. And I remember that, what if I slice this up like bologna? And so that's what I did. And then that led to arranging them and then hanging them on the wall and then doing the single landscape. So it almost started with a process such as slicing up this log before I said, oh, I have a great idea. I'm just going to make a composite landscape on the wall. It was actually doing something with the log that led to the composite landscape.
Thank you. I have a question. So when you're making your works, are you thinking about it as first from the aspect of environmentalism, or first as from an aspect of the art and the visual of what you're painting and thinking about?
I rarely start my work saying, you know, I might have a vague idea such as, okay, I want to do a work that I'm painting on ash, right? Ash wood. So I want to tie it in with the emerald ash borer, which is this huge issue in North America. Or I might want to do a wallpaper about the sea level rise. So I'll start like that. But then I switch, a lot of times I'll just switch into what image is really compelling and really beautiful. I'll go there next. And then as I'm working on the piece, usually as I'm working on the piece and into the piece, then things start to make connections with the environment. I don't really go out saying, I'm going to make an environmental piece that tells people not to use fossil fuels. You know, I don't do that. I think the real driving force is beauty, basically.
Thank you. Now I think I want to hand it off to you and Laura for any last closing thoughts, and then I think Sarah Linda will let us know about some upcoming programs and what we have going on at the museum. So Laura, if you want.
I just want to thank Alison. Even though I've been following your art for years, I feel like I've learned so much more about it today. And it's always such a treat to really get into the mindset of the artist and hear a lot more about your technique and your ideas. And I know Sarah Linda always has some closing comments about some of our related programming.
So yes, thank you so much, Laura. And Alison, thank you so much. I feel the same way as Laura, as much as I've admired and studied your work over the years. This was so illuminating. And I just have to share one really quick story. Remember when you talked about your friend up in Greenwich and the fallen trees? Well, back when during imaging the river, there was a big storm in Yonkers with a lot of fallen trees. And I was so inspired by your work. I wanted to create a workshop for middle school kids to understand your practice and to practice what you do. So I was able to work with someone in Parks and Rec who actually sliced up the trees for me. And I don't know if you remember, and we had these little log slices that kids were able to paint on. It was obviously not the way you do. And I'm sure there were like all kinds of inherent vice and things inside the wood because we didn't have time to dry it. But at least they had the experience and also sort of the meta experience of what you do. So you have inspired generations at the Hudson River Museum. And I just wanted to thank you for that, Alison. And thank you, Laura, for the conversation, and Olivia for your fine facilitation. And to our audience, thank you for being here and for asking your wonderful questions. Just a couple things coming up before the holidays and after. Next week, we have on Saturday a panel with the 3 muralists in our other exhibition, Women to the Fore, which really Alison kind of straddles both because she is a female artist and she is a landscape and eco artist. But these are the muralists, Katori Walker, Patricia Santos, and Nancy Mendez, who will be in conversation with our director and CEO, Masha Turchinsky, on our art, ourselves. Artists embrace their roles in the community and beyond. So I invite everyone to that next Saturday afternoon. And next Sunday afternoon, you can once again see Alison's work and the other works in landscape art and virtual travel in a docent tour with our very own David Lucas, who's been here today. And we're really excited to have him take us through the exhibition, which I must once again thank Art Bridges for their generous sponsorship. Then between Christmas and New Year's holidays, we are open Monday through Thursday from 12 to 5 with tours at 1, 2, and 3 of Glenview that's decorated for the holidays. And that will also give people the opportunity to see landscape art and virtual travel in person. So I think with that, I just want to say, everyone, please stay healthy. Yes, and safe over the holidays. Enjoy them with whomever, wherever. Take care. And here's to a peaceful and hopeful new year. Thank you all so much again.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.